Welcome to our webinar, a step-by-step guide for budgeting with COVID funding. I am your presenter, Rhonda Henderson, a strategic partnership specialist with EdOps. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues who delivered our live presentation. Shelley Hughes, our National Finance Team Director, Xiao Liu, a Finance Lead, Darius Munchak, Finance Specialist, and Stephen Sheffield. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation in our live format. Our agenda today includes discussing an equity mindset within budgeting. Our pandemic revealed that we have to take a look at what each student needs in order to help them to exit the pandemic successfully. We're also going to discuss the federal grants that are available, as there have been multiple grants extended to support schools in returning from the pandemic. Then we'll give you an overview on a process to build a multi-year grant budget. It includes 3 steps, and I'll walk through each one in detail. In our live session, we included Q&A, and we've embedded some of those questions into our presentation. Let's begin with thinking about how to design for equity in our finance and operations. There are multiple definitions for equity, and many people may think of different things when they think about equity. So I'm going to share with you how we're thinking about equity in the context of this presentation. Equity means a commitment to ensuring that each student receives what they need to have a successful outcome in learning. So we think about providing resources according to what students need and not just exactly what each student is receiving or families are receiving. A mindset then begins with the end in mind. You think about, how is this person going to be affected, and can we design a process that meets their particular needs? A question that you might ask might be, in this process, who's winning and who's losing based on this decision, and does it have to be that way? You might also consider, if you have to make a decision within a time crunch, what's the best decision possible, and what do you need to come back and address at a later time? Another important question is, who needs to be involved in this decision making? In the extension of ESSER funds, there is a requirement that the public be involved in your decision making. And we think that that's a good practice to involve multiple stakeholders in your decision making. A school leader told us that one high impact decision you can make to establish equity in your process is to reach out to people who don't typically show up to these conversations. Maybe they are not always on the invite list, or they may not always speak up in meetings, but a leader can make a concerted effort to gain their perspective to try to resolve an equitable outcome. I'd like to share a specific example from my background where I applied an approach that relied on an equal distribution of resources, but not an equitable distribution of resources. At the time, our McKinney-Vento Act required that we provide transportation resources for students who were experiencing homelessness. So the process was to give each family 2 packs of tokens. That was taking an equal approach. However, we unintentionally created losers out of this situation, and that became evident to me when I saw one student's attendance drop off midway through the month. The reason for that, when I took a moment to actually talk with this family, was that the amount of 2 packs was actually insufficient for their needs. They lived a distance further from the school than what 2 packs of tokens would cover. When we learned what the actual distance was and the actual requirement, we extended our resources to provide for them what they needed. Of course, that meant spending more money, and so what we did was we then appealed to our CFO to apply for more federal funding to support their needs. This opened my eyes to how we can apply an approach of equity to finances to set students up to be successful and to eliminate this unintentional situation where we created losers out of a policy. Let's think about this approach as we continue in building our COVID budget. Let's turn now to the resources available through the multiple funding relief bills that the government has passed recently. There are 3 ESSER grants divided into 3 parts. Or rather, there is 1 grant divided into 3 parts, parts 1, 2, and 3. All of the ESSER allocations are based on a percentage of a school's Title I funding. So, ESSER 1 funding equaled roughly 80% of a school's Title I funding. Funding for ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 increased exponentially. ESSER 2 equaled 4 times ESSER 1, and ESSER 3 funds were 2 times ESSER 2. For example, if your Title I funding equaled $100,000, then over the next 3.5 years, your ESSER funding would total over $1 million. So you have a significant amount of money available to support students and families during this difficult and challenging time. What are the award periods? ESSER 1 runs from March 13, 2020, a day my colleague Shelley Hughes calls Freaky Friday, through September 30th, 2022. The ESSER 2 award period ends in September 2023, and the ESSER 3 period ends in September 2024. These are national timelines, which may be slightly different by region. So these grants total a significant amount of money and span multiple years. We are here to help you manage these complexities with a step-by-step budgeting process. Taking a closer look at ESSER 3 grant, we see it is both unique and prescriptive. It is prescriptive in 2 ways. First, schools must complete a reopening plan, make the plan available to the public on the website, and allow for public comment. That's the stakeholder engagement that I mentioned when we were discussing equity. The second prescription is that 20% of ESSER 3 funding must be used to address learning loss through evidence-based interventions for special populations of underrepresented groups. Again, this supports the point of thinking about funding and needs from an equity perspective. Allowable uses to address learning loss include summer learning or summer enrichment, extended day, comprehensive after-school programs, or extended school year programs. What does evidence-based actually mean? Well, some states have a list of vendors who meet this descriptor of evidence-based. Here, you may choose to go with a well-known vendor, local or national, with a strong reputation. Some leaders have shared with us that in this moment, you don't want people to question your choices. The evidence of the program's value and effectiveness should be easy to point to. In many jurisdictions, there is also a CARES equivalent funding, which is funding for schools that do not receive Title I funding due to the demographics of the school population. Perhaps these schools serve early childhood students or adult populations. The allowable uses, the award periods, may vary by state. In most jurisdictions, ESSER funds are not subject to the supplement, not supplant policy. These funds can pay for things that were previously paid for using local dollars. The funds are flexible and easy to use. So thinking about the allowable uses, we see that there is a broad range of allowable uses for most of these federal programs. Taking a look now at the allowable activities, let's get into a little bit of detail. Here you can see the broad range of allowable activities for each grant. If the activities are in support of addressing learning loss, meeting the needs for underrepresented groups, plans to reopen safely, an effort to support students through long-term closures, or to offer mental health support, ESSER can cover it. Think of the State Farm insurance advertisement. If you've seen it, we've covered it. An important consideration is how to avoid the fiscal cliff and to set yourself up for a sustainable budget. Note that, again, the ESSER funds can be used to maintain school operations, including continuing to employ existing staff. So the ESSER funds have a built-in mechanism to continue your operations, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we think about how you will allocate your expenses. Since ESSER funds can cover so many uses, it will not be challenging to find a use for the funding. But it may be challenging to tell the story about your budget, which you will probably be asked to tell on multiple occasions. You can see that the New York Times has picked up this story, as have many papers, because this is an unprecedented situation that we're funding, and we recognize that the challenge is great to meet this moment. So what is the headline about how your school is using your funds? And what are the details that support that headline? Here are two examples. If you plan to use ESSER funds for additional activities because perhaps you are facing a financial situation where you have a slight surplus, your headline might be, "We are using COVID funds to run a robust summer program for the next few years and bring in additional mental health supports." If you are facing a tight financial situation, and we know that many schools are, your headline might be, "We are using COVID funds to maintain our program, including interventions for students who have experienced trauma and learning loss." If you take a long-term approach, think about, what do you want your headline to be 5 years from now when you look back? What do you want to read about how your school used COVID funding for learning after the pandemic? Now that we've discussed the funding available, let's focus on how to develop a multi-year budget. We've divided this into 3 steps as an initial start and a way to help you think about this in an organized fashion. We're also going to use a metaphor that my colleague Darius employs. He's based in New Orleans, and so he thinks about COVID budgeting through the lens of gumbo. So we're going to take that idea and break it into 3 steps. So one of the first things that we're going to do is to determine the base or the root. What are you working with? What are the options available? What kind of funding, state, local, and non-COVID funding is available to you? Step 2 is to add the Trinity. In this case, our Trinity is a comprehensive list of the items that you need to return back to school or continue school. And we categorize that into 3 buckets, buckets A, B, and C. Here, it's important that your finance team and program team are strongly aligned on the available funds and how those funds will be used. So we'll be talking about a comprehensive list of items or your ingredients, and then categorizing them into 3 buckets. Step 3 is where the variation comes in, but of course, it's variation with a very strategic approach in mind. And in that case, you might think of, how would you flavor your gumbo? Maybe you like a seafood gumbo with crawfish, or perhaps you enjoy a chicken and sausage mix. Similarly, your states may have specific requirements on timing and allowable uses, but of course, all for good reason and with a very strategic approach in mind. So let's take a look now at the funding that is available in your landscape, assessing the funding in the landscape. We're looking at 3 potential options. Your funding in your local environment may have decreased, remained flat, or your non-COVID related funding may be expected to decrease. So let's assess that environment. In New Orleans, they know that their funding will decrease because during the pandemic, tourist revenue decreased. everyone is aware of that circumstance and they're going to plan accordingly. Likely, federal dollars will be used to maintain current operations. If your local funding has remained flat or will increase, then you may use funding to add programs. Be mindful of the award period for the federal dollars that you're receiving, so that your budget is sustainable over the long time. Next, to categorize the ingredients as we think about making our gumbo, we've assessed our resources. Now, we're going to return to that idea of the comprehensive list of things that we need and how you'll assign them by bucket. For some schools, as we mentioned, this may be the first time that your public revenue is actually at the level that kids deserves. Additionally, ESSER calls for schools to think about students' different needs, as we talked about earlier when we were thinking about equity. Students who receive free or reduced lunch, students who are learning English, and students who receive special education are getting that particular attention to meet their needs so that they can return to school in the traditional format, ready and prepared to access their grade level content. The mix of public revenue sources is likely to continue to fluctuate, so just keep that in mind. How can you meet your community's needs? Again, we have that comprehensive list divided into 3 buckets, A, B, and C. Following the guidance of the federal grant itself to address learning loss, we begin with the who and list them in bucket A. Who do you need to bring on to help meet students' learning goals? For those of you with a state or local revenue shortfall, you're probably thinking about how to maintain your existing staff roster in order to address student needs. We start with the who, the staff, for a second reason, because those annual expenses are large, stable, and predictable. This makes budgeting and submitting those reimbursements much easier. And while state education agency regulations may vary, many schools have found that using staff salaries first and foremost in budgets makes the state monitoring easier. For example, there is a compliance requirement of completing time and effort reports, and that's made easier when you use staff salary for these grants. If your funding is constrained, as in the case in New Orleans, then maybe you're focused again on maintaining your current staff, and your ESSER funding will go to this need. So your full of part-time employees will be listed into bucket A. Staffing isn't the only solution for every school or for all students' needs. We do have other items that are needed. As mentioned earlier, ESSER funds are flexible in use. These grants allow us to purchase a wide variety of goods and services. For example, PD for teachers, art workshops for students, college prep workshops for families, tutoring services, cleaning services, a new floor, buffer, or even construction services. We're going to include goods and services in either bucket B or C, and the same advice from earlier applies. The largest, most predictable expenses you can think of should be listed first. Our third bucket, C, has a specific requirement. That is, if your project involves the use of construction, alteration, or repair, including painting or decorating of public buildings, it goes in this bucket, bucket C. New carpets, go here. New HVAC, go here. A mural garden, here. Everyone else in the realm of goods and services falls into bucket B, professional development for staff, cleaning services, and contracted instruction. A final word of caution about procurement. Purchasing goods and services should still follow your internal, local, and state procurement guidelines. For example, in Washington, D.C., those guidelines are set by the Public Charter School Board. The federal government also has tiered procurement rules, which require action before and after a purchase. That being said, once you navigate that guidance, you can include up to $250,000 per purchase in your budget. Now that you have a robust list of items, our grocery list, with prices for the items that we would include, the ingredients in our gumbo, you can begin to plan out the next few years of spending and grant reimbursement. Recall, large predictable expenses are the easiest thing to include in the budget for federal grants, i.e. large consistent contracts or planned purchases of goods. Let's look at Bucket A expenses and estimate how much of each person's compensation should be coming from the grant, and then extend that out for 5 years. Remember, our Bucket A included the who that we need to support students. This is not saying that the annual compensation for an academic dean is $30,000. It says that $30,000 of their salary will be reimbursed from this grant. Reminder, the TAC portion should align or be no more than the proportion of time these employees spend on the programs outlined in your grant application. Now, let's take a look at these Bucket B expenses. Remember, Bucket B included goods and services. Estimate how much of each purchase should be grant funded. It's okay if it's 100% of the cost, but again, be mindful of procurement rules. Then extend that out for 5 years. In this example, the cleaning services and remote learning platform are to extend evenly out for the next 5 years. You might have different expectations for your vendors. Your goods purchases could also be one time rather than ongoing. Perfectly fine. Finally, take Bucket C expenses and enter them into the years that they're most likely to be completed. If you have multiple Bucket C expenses, try to avoid entering multiple federally funded facility projects in 1 year, as these projects are administratively burdensome. Note also that in this example, salary reimbursements are consistent every year, but you can vary that amount if needed. You can also choose to reimburse an item for 2 years of the grant, then not for the remaining years. Now that you have an estimate of what your spending will look like for the next 5 years, it's time to figure out which of the ESSER grants is paying for what, and then make sure that your spending is and your timing is aligned with the award period. So we're now going to look at how to allocate the costs to each grant. You may be tempted to think about mixing and matching the grants without a clear plan, but what we would like to suggest is that you take a very structured approach to assigning your expenses to your grants, just like we take a deliberate approach when we construct our gumbo. So beginning with the list of the COVID grants, and you would add the specific details. Those details include the allocation dollars, if the grant is more or less restrictive to other grants, and the end date. Remember that we outlined these expenses at the beginning of the webinar, the details such as the allocation, the restriction, and the end date. That farmers insurance reference, that if you need it, then they have seen it, and that ESSER grants are generally flexible, that the supplement not supplant rule does not apply, and that ESSER grants will increase slightly in its restriction from 1 to 3. Remember that 20% of funds required to address learning loss for underrepresented groups in ESSER 3. You may also receive local funds, so you can add those to your list. We've worked with a school in Michigan that received a technology grant which has a subject restriction, but not a time restriction. So the grant funding should go towards technology, but the timing was less restrictive. So you'll list this grant as well and assign a technology expense to that grant. Another point to consider is whether you want to spend all of the funds from a particular grant in 1 year, meaning draw it down as quickly as you can, or if you want to draw down funds over the entire grant period. This decision really depends on your particular situation and circumstances, such as whether you need to increase your cash position or if you need to maintain a consistent position over time or a stable budget over time. Again, that is specific to your particular need. Now that we have made those restrictions, we are ready to assign costs to the most restricted grant. In this example, the CARE equivalent funding, we see that it is less restrictive than our local COVID grant, but it's more restrictive than our funding grant. And here, we continue to assign expense allocated from bucket A, our staff bucket, the WHO, and we've allocated $30,000 from fiscal year 21. Lastly, assign expenses to your least restrictive grants. And we've been discussing all along that ESSER funding is very flexible, and so you see that multiple expenses are assigned to ESSER's 1, 2, and 3 grants. Again, you're assigning in timeline order to be sure that you can spend down in a consistent manner and over the award period. You'll also see that the grants include expenses from all 3 buckets, again speaking to that flexibility. So, congratulations, you have a delicious COVID grant budget gumbo. During our live webinar, we took a Q&A from the audience, and if you have questions, please do feel free to be in touch with us about your particular circumstance. If there is an issue that you would like to dig into, you have our contact information, so please do use it. Additionally, this webinar may have sparked questions or thoughts about your data program, so please stay tuned for an upcoming webinar addressing the specific tools and analytics that EdOps can provide to address learning loss using your ESSER 3 funding. At EdOps, we want you to win. That is why we work closely with our schools to minimize the challenges associated with finance and data management, which we hope will free up space and time and give you the confidence to go forward with your academic program. You can visit us at our online home at ed-ops.com, and my information is also here, Rhonda at ed-ops.com. Thank you for participating in our webinar, and we wish you all the best success as you meet students' needs in these challenging times. We look forward to reading about your success in those headlines.